Whiskey Butler, take 25. Howdy! Welcome to the Whiskey Butler. I am your host, Wesley Butler, here to spread a little whiskey wisdom to you today. Welcome to part 2 of the What is American Whiskey series, we'll call it. In part 1, we talked about my just whiskey category. But if you don't remember what we talked about in part 1, let me run down those 7 categories of whiskey that I think there are for American whiskey. So we have bourbon, we got Tennessee whiskey, we got corn whiskey, we have just whiskey, we have spirit whiskey, light whiskey, and blended whiskey, okay? So here in part 2, we're going to talk about corn whiskey. I got a couple of corn whiskeys here that I'm going to talk about, but before we get to those, let's talk about what exactly corn whiskey is, okay? Corn whiskey has a mash bill of at least 80% corn, right? So when we talked about in part 1, the just whiskey, your namesake grain had to be at least 51% of the mash bill. But in corn whiskey, you got to be at least 80% of the mash bill, right? Okay, so that's a lot of corn, right? So we're going 80% of the mash bill, but a few of the other things are still the same. We're still talking about 80% alcohol by volume distilling, so it can't come off the still higher than 160 proof. We're still talking about at least 40% alcohol by volume when it goes into the bottle, right? So it has to be bottled at least 80 proof. What did I not talk about? What did I not talk about? I didn't talk about what proof it had to be when it went into the container to age, because you know what? Corn whiskey doesn't have to be aged. You don't have to age corn whiskey. But if you do age corn whiskey, it's got to be in uncharred or used oak containers. Because if I put it in the new charred oak containers, it's going to be what?
Bourbon.
That's right, studio audience. It's going to be bourbon, right? So we're not talking about bourbon today. We're talking about corn whiskey, okay? So we got 2 different corn whiskeys for you right here. Also, you can't treat corn whiskey with charred wood. And that's important as I talk about my first corn whiskey here, which is called, it's called Louthan Distilling's Baltimore Oak Aged Corn Whiskey, right? So that's not like the most snazziest of names, but that's what it is. It's a corn whiskey made right here in the free state of Maryland, right up outside of Baltimore. It's actually, when I say it's a homegrown operation, it's literally a homegrown operation. It's a father-daughter combination. Father engineer built the still or designed the still himself. Daughter does the distilling, right? And it's 100% mash bill, 100% corn, right? And you're like, okay, well, where does the color come from, right? So they do age it, but it's aged in just these clear jugs, but they drop some wood chips in them to add the color and to get a little flavor. They're not charred wood chips, they're just wood chips, right? So they drop those in there for about 60 days or whatever, and then bam, you got your corn whiskey, right? So part 1, we had a local, because I live here in Maryland, we had a local whiskey in part 1. We got another local whiskey here in part 2, talking about corn whiskey. So this is my virgin tasting of the Louthan Distilling Corn Whiskey, okay? It's my virgin tasting. So let's see what we got here. Very subtle on the nose, which you would expect to get with all that corn in there, right? It's not going to jump out at you. I'm trying to look at the color here. A little light amber color. Okay, so the wood chips did their job. But what's it taste like? Let's see what it tastes like. Now, if you've ever had corn whiskey, you know it's super sweet, right? It's 100% corn, right? So it's going to be super, super sweet. So that's what I expect this to be before I even taste it. So let's see what we get. Yeah. It's definitely got a sweetness to it. No bite. What's my studio audience think?
Maybe a little bite.
But
not terrible.
You know, actually, I thought it was going to be super, super sweet because I've had some other corn whiskeys that were really sweet. This is not that way. This is not that way. So I'm actually really happy to find that out. That's a good corn whiskey. That's a good corn whiskey. Okay. All right. Well, way to go there, Louthan. Okay. Our next corn whiskey here is the George Dickel White Corn Whiskey #1 recipe. Okay. Now, what's the main difference you see between these two whiskeys here, right? Do I have to say it? Do I have to say it? We've been talking about it in America for a long time. It's the color. Oh, yeah. We got a white whiskey here. We have a non-white whiskey here, okay? Well, why is this whiskey white? Well, that's because it's unaged. This is what it looks like when it comes off of the still right here, okay? No wood chips, no oak container. This is just what the whiskey tastes like, okay? Now, George Dickel actually fits into 2 categories of American whiskey. It is a corn whiskey. It is also a Tennessee whiskey, okay? But we're not going to talk about Tennessee whiskey here. Just know that in order to be a Tennessee whiskey, there's some other steps that are involved to doing that, okay? We'll get into that in a future episode. Okay, but right now we're talking about the corn whiskey. We actually know the mash bill on well, we know the mash bill on this one too. It's 100% corn. But we know the mash bill on this one is 8% malted barley, 8% rye, do the math, 84% corn, right? So we got 84% corn, 8% rye, 8% malted barley. That's actually the recipe for a lot of George Dickel whiskey. This is the base foundation for a lot of future George Dickel recipes. So if you're drinking George Dickel whiskey out there, this is what it comes from. But this is the unaged version of it, right? So we're not even talking about no straight, no 2 years, no 6 months, no 60 days, no whatever. Bam. This is what it comes off the still at. Actually, I think it's been proofed down a little bit. Probably been proofed down a little bit. It's at 91 proof right here. But yeah, we got a little unaged corn whiskey here. So let's see what we get. So the nose on this, you can actually smell more of the sweetness in the nose on this than you could on this, right? And I think it's because the wood sort of like dilutes some of the sweetness smell to it. But this has been, this doesn't have that. So you're just getting that genuine smell. Oh yeah. Now, so you can really taste the corn in this, but you're not tasting the super sweetness corn. Some corn whiskeys out there I like to describe as diabetes in a bottle, right? Because it's just overly sweet. You don't get that with this, right? And it's probably because the rye and the malted barley, definitely the malted barley, mellow it out. You're not going to get any of those vanilla tastes or whatever, because you get all those from the charred oak containers, right? But this, you can taste the corn in this, but it's not overly sweet. Yeah, this is good stuff. This is good stuff. George Dickel likes to describe its bourbon as mellow as moonlight. Mellow as moonlight. All right. Well, moonlight is not this color. Moonlight is not white, but this whiskey is mellow. So, those are your differences in corn whiskey. You can get an unaged corn whiskey, right? Or you can get an aged corn whiskey that has a little color to it, but this wasn't even aged in a container. There's plenty of corn whiskeys out there that are actually aged in barrels. Remember, it can't go into a charred barrel, has to be a used barrel. I got a corn whiskey downstairs. I got the Balcones True Blue 100. That's, I actually don't remember how long it's been aged, but we're not talking about that one today. We'll talk about that one when we talk about Texas whiskeys, okay? But corn whiskey, there's a lot of different varieties of corn. There's a lot you can do with corn whiskey, right? You can unage it. You can drop some wood chips in it. You can put it in a used barrel. There's so much you can do with corn whiskey. And this, if you were to put this in a charred oak barrel, it would all of a sudden go from corn whiskey to bourbon, right? So, yeah, there's a lot going on with American whiskey. So, If I had to pick between the two of these, I don't know. It would be tough. It'd be tough because there's such a different flavor profile. Such a different flavor profile. So I'm not going to do that to you, America. I'm not going to do that to you. I'm not going to pick between one or the other. So yeah. But all I'm going to say is both of these are worth picking up if you can find them at your local liquor store. Don't know if you're going to find this one. I actually found this one at my local liquor store on the bottom shelf because I actually don't even know if the Louthan Distilling is still in business, right? But if this had a little dust on the bottle, which I think that's a country song, a little dust on the bottle. But it had a little dust on the bottle when I picked it up today. But it's good, still good. This you can find in most liquor stores along with other George Dickel whiskeys. This is probably around, I don't know, it's probably around 25 bucks. This was like 40 today. I think it was 40 because it's hard to find now and they're not making anymore. But definitely go try some corn whiskey out there. And I appreciate you watching. Thank you for joining the Whiskey Butler, and we'll see you at the next episode.